My name is John Grimm, and I co-direct the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale. And with Mary Evelyn Tucker, we run a master's degree program between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale and the Divinity School at Yale. So it's a program in which students spend a year approximately at each school, and afterwards they come out with a master's degree, which they can take towards environmental organizations or into religious organizations that have environmental implications. And what I find especially interesting now is philanthropic organizations, foundations that help support this work. When I began my graduate studies in the 60s, I eventually began to focus on indigenous traditions and studied with Native American, American Indian peoples, First Nations people. Find that the variety of names now that are being used suggests all of the ambiguity that we have in dominant nation states towards these people who were overwhelmed by the development of the nation states. And in those studies, I found myself consistently hearing the stories of reality that people would tell. Anishinaabe peoples in the Great Lakes, Crow peoples, a Siouan-speaking people on the Northern Plains, and Okanagan peoples in Washington, Colville Reservation. The sense of these stories, or cosmologies, the technical term often used for these stories that talk about the nature of reality. And as I studied with my mentor, Thomas Berry, he was progressively interested in the environmental questions, and we began to connect the sense of stories, or the cosmologies that people told, the values embedded in them were often directly related to the natural world. So that began to orient me towards environmental concerns, but from a slightly different direction, not simply an academic direction. It had those implications, ethnography and the study of the history of this tradition, but also the values that these people maintained in order to live in relationship with plant life, animal life, in relation to the season. So as a historian of religion, we bring a slightly different approach to environmental issues than simply policy or natural science. I've heard many times over my life, oh, you study with Native American peoples? There are still such peoples? Are they still living in teepees? That kind of thing. Knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge and the understanding of the world, as you put it, is in the mythologies, they're seen as descriptive of reality, and then as we enter into empirical observation and experimental method, we've increased, intensified, and corrected the knowledge that we have. And I basically disagree with that position. I think that mythologies existed in the past, which had etiological or descriptive characteristics that were childlike or can be described as superstitious. But those mythologies, I think, that kind of knowledge endures into the present. So I think we have, I would say, some of the climate denial. People who live in that type of perspective are living in a kind of mythological bubble too. And their bubble, I think, is a kind of progress bubble. And I think it's similar to the mode of knowledge that you've presented. Namely, we've arrived at a scientific understanding, and coupled with technology, we can deal with anything. There's no problem we can't deal with. I would again disagree with that position, just as I disagreed with you in a friendly way, because I think knowledge has been embedded in the human family from our emergence as a species. And so I question my own participation in this progress myth, and I question it in the sense that I feel we humans, when we emerged, however we emerged, out of the trees, onto the savannah, standing on two legs, and we came to some understanding of ourselves in a social group. Maybe that was primary. We weren't individuated first. We were socialized first and then began to individuate or become individual second. And that sense of the human species, we had knowledge generating faculties. So that I find myself quite attracted to a mode of perception of the world that I call sensing, minding, creating. That this body that we inhabit is very old, and the brain we have it's very old, and how it was formulated is related to this emergence that we have as a species. And so we've known the world in the way we sense it, and we have the five senses, but I'm also talking about sense of wonder, sense of happiness, sense of joy, that all of this sensing of the world is related to cellular life. I think it's constantly probing and sensing. I think trees, the relationship between rhizome and fungal activity, these communities are constantly signaling to one another, sensing the world, and minding. We're making decisions. And I think our early ancestors were knowledge generating in the sense they were sensing the world, they were thinking about the world, and creating this capacity of the human to dream, to emerge. And so sensing, minding, creating, I think, is as active now as it was with our early emergence as a species. And so many of the questions we're dealing with in terms of Abrahamic traditions, so we've become very sophisticated with regard to language, and we have terminology to categorize and, in a sense, to compartmentalize so that we can see these different areas, Abrahamic tradition, separating South Asian, East Asian, indigenous, Pacific. But in fact, they're so interwoven. We are so interwoven. We're such a interdependent species, and our knowledge generating is interdependent. And again, my basic point is indigenous knowledge, to draw on the studies that I do, indigenous knowledge and understanding of plant life and biodiversity, I find is often much more sophisticated among the people that I study with than it is among people in dominant societies. Again, all families might participate on both sides of the question, and I find in my family that's the case. And I find some members it's not possible to have the conversation because it's fun to be provocative. So no matter what I say, they'll take a different position. But there are others in which they take the conversation seriously. And I find three areas in which we share ground, which we can talk about: children, food, and health. And those are areas like with an older brother or sister, if they're not at all, they're maybe oriented towards a political party that is not attuned to climate change. And they'll say, well, if it's not a hoax, it's just a cycle. And my comeback is often, well, if it's a cycle, or if indeed the science is helping us to understand that our world is changing in a significant way, and the changes are, they have the character of momentum, that we are not able to simply change or pivot quickly. And these changes will be with us for a long time, and we have the possibilities to shape how much change the atmosphere and climate will undertake, or how little it will change, or how diminished the change will be. That children, I find, are a way to suddenly change the conversation. Our children, our grandchildren, what kind of world will they have, and what do you hope for them, and is it worth listening to the discussion and finding some kind of shared ground, that we begin to change our lifestyle so that we're meeting the needs that are required and begin to vote for candidates who are talking about these issues. So it's a very difficult conversation, but with my family, then children, but with students, and students are generally not deniers, but I think they bring a topic which I find interesting to talk with people who are unsure, ambiguous about climate change or actually denial, namely food and the understanding of healthy food, of sustainable food, and what kind of food are we eating now, how is it produced, and those kind of issues. Students are very keen on those, the distribution issues, social justice issues, as well as the ecological, the sense of how it's grown, who's tending it, how are those people who are growing food, how are they tended? So again, a social justice issue there. And health, I think, is very much in the air. I think will surface again in our elections as it has in the past. We're beginning to hear candidates who talk about long-term health commitments, not just reducing them to the economic issues, certainly important, but they're also the social issues. There's several points that surface as I hear my colleagues speak. First, I think, is the sense of disciplinary boundaries. I think a conference such as this is making us very aware that we have been trained. So again, differentiation. We have been trained in different perspectives. We have approaches that bring us to the material. We ask different questions, and we have perhaps different insights as a historian of religion interested in how particular religious practice developed, what's its cultural context, environmental, the environmental context in which it developed. So the conference here reaches across disciplines. I think that's silo, not breaking, but silo bridging. A lot of it's going on the silos that we establish in our disciplines, and this is my area. Suddenly there's a lot of bridging going on here. That's very positive. Begin to think about, say, patriarchy and the question of population, birth control, and women's equity. These kinds of issues, we're approaching them from economic issues, cultural, anthropological, ethnological perspectives, and then the values embedded in religious traditions. What's the role of women in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity? Or the lack of role, and yet what are in the household, when the women begin to control their lives and the possibility of children, how does that surface, or how is it masked in religious perspectives when men play the dominant religious roles and seem to make pronouncements about what constitutes a appropriate and healthy household? So there are very interesting the ways in which these perspectives are being blended, the discipline are being bridged and blended together. Early on, I made the comment about exclusive and inclusive. That would be one perspective, and maybe all of us move between those two perspectives at any moment where we feel we are in a tradition that has some revealed insight about the nature of reality, or we have a sense of our tradition, but we're open to other paths. So most indigenous people that I study with, those elders, they talk about paths, and they're very individuated. If you experience a vision, it's yours to follow. And who is someone else to tell you the yay or nay of your vision? You have it and you have to follow it. But there's so many ways to approach this question. I would conclude by saying I'm very influenced again by my teacher, Thomas Berry, who introduced me to a perspective which I think is still very difficult to understand what he was about, but it's very appealing. Namely, the sense that traditions, they talk to one another about the pragmatic issues, say, of couples who intermarry and who will have children, and how do they relate to one family who's one religion and one family another religion. And those are very pragmatic problems that are worked out in conversation in day-to-day life. But the theoretical and those theoretical issues that have deeper implications, where religions are seen not simply as complementary to one another, but religions completing one another. In other words, there's something about Islam that Christianity and Judaism don't have. And there's something about Judaism that Christianity has. There's something about Buddhism, the sense of suffering in Buddhism, and Confucianism, the way in which an individual is placed in that tradition, the heaven, earth, and human perspective, concentric circles where they're discovering their relationship in the family, friendship, society, natural world, political world, the cosmos. That sense of that tradition is really, it's unique, and yet it says something to Christianity, says something to Judaism, says something to Islam. So I have a perspective that I'm searching for in other traditions, how they complete my own, but I have a sense of my own, and am not abandoning that which I was raised with, but am constantly trying to push the envelopes of my own birth background, my own birth tradition, and understand what the world offers, what the world is teaching. It's a kind of a chicken and an egg question for me, the human and the world, which we are part of, and yet we use the term nature, and the chicken, in order to get out of the egg, has to break it open. And I think that's what we're called to do in our own time. We have to face our brokenness. We have a broken world, and in order to fix it, I think we have to go through it. There's going to be a bottleneck, and your generation's going to see it more acutely than I will, and your generation after you will experience more acutely, where there will be a deep grieving for what we've lost, and that brokenness will either break us or will open us to something that will be a powerful vision going forward. Will it be one? I don't think so. It'll be differentiated. It'll be in all of these traditions. If they come through it, they'll see something, and we humans will transform ourselves, are changed. Oh, and that our children will go forward with all the children of all the species, because if we don't all go forward, none of us are going forward.